He always believed that their love was strong and their marriage honest. But in the last moments of her life, his wife confessed what she had been hiding all her life. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The year was 1955. In a world divided by color, the United States still clung tightly to the chains of racial segregation. Jim Crow laws dictated where a black man could walk, eat, sit, or even look. Interracial relationships were not just frowned upon, they were dangerous. A black man caught in the wrong place with a white woman could be beaten, imprisoned, or worse. The South was particularly cruel in its enforcement of these unspoken rules, but the North, though less brutal, was still no haven. Oliver Bryant had learned these lessons young. Born into poverty in a small southern town, he had spent his life watching men like his father struggle under the weight of a system designed to keep them down. His father had been a factory worker. His mother, a tired woman who spent more time scrubbing floors in white homes than in her own. Oliver had worked from the time he could walk, fixing cars alongside his uncles, learning the way engines breathed and groaned under the weight of labor. By the time he turned 18, he had become a mechanic in a small auto shop, one of the few jobs where a black man could earn an honest living without serving a white boss face to face. Oliver was tall and lean, his skin dark as polished mahogany. He had a quiet confidence that unnerved white men and intrigued white women, a dangerous combination in the world he lived in. But Oliver had never been foolish enough to entertain such dangers. He had seen what happened to black boys who let their eyes linger too long on white skin. That was until Sarah Whitmore. Sarah had never known poverty. Born into a prominent white family, she had spent her childhood in silk dresses and expensive shoes, her days structured by etiquette lessons and social events designed to mold her into the perfect Southern wife. Her father, Charles Whitmore, was a man of influence, a businessman whose wealth came not just from investments, but from the power he held over others. He believed in bloodlines, in purity, in the superiority of those who shared his complexion. But Sarah had never felt at home in her father's world. She had grown up suffocating under the weight of expectations she did not wish to meet. She was supposed to be quiet, obedient, demure. Instead, she was curious, restless, always searching for something beyond the perfect life laid out for her. The night she met Oliver, she was 18 years old. The summer heat clung to her skin as she slipped into a dress she had been told was too bold, too revealing. The air smelled of whiskey and cigarette smoke as she entered the dimly lit basement where the music of rebellion played, jazz, smooth and electric, notes curling around the edges of segregation like whispers of defiance. The party was one of the few places where color lines blurred. Young people, black, white, and everything in between, came together in secret, sharing drinks, laughter, and glances that could never be exchanged in daylight. It was there that Oliver first saw her. She was nothing like the white women he had been warned about. There was no fear in her eyes when she met his gaze, no hesitation in the way she moved toward him. Her blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders, her blue eyes alight with something dangerous, curiosity, excitement, defiance. She asked his name. He hesitated. She smiled, and suddenly Oliver found himself speaking, his voice low and careful, as if testing the air between them. They talked for hours, their words slipping into the space between them with ease. She was fascinated by the world he came from, the way he spoke, the way he thought. He was wary but intrigued by her boldness, by the way she seemed untouched by the fear that governed his own life. It was intoxicating. It was foolish. It was inevitable. When the night ended, she told him she wanted to see him again. He knew he should walk away, but he didn't. The first time her father saw them together, it was an accident. Oliver had been working late at the auto shop when Sarah appeared at the edge of the garage, her pale skin illuminated by the glow of the street lamp. His heart clenched as he glanced around, his pulse hammering in his ears. She shouldn't be there. It wasn't safe. But before he could usher her away, a black car pulled up to the curb. Charles Whitmore stepped out. The world seemed to stop. Oliver saw the moment realization dawned in the man's eyes, the way his face twisted in rage, the way his body tensed with the kind of fury only white men had the privilege of expressing. Sarah tried to speak, but her father silenced her with a glare so cold it could have frozen the summer air. Then, without another word, he grabbed her by the arm and dragged her away. Oliver didn't move. He knew better than to follow. The next morning, he found a note slipped under the door of the garage. "Stay away from my daughter." It wasn't a warning. It was a threat. And for the first time in his life, Oliver realized that he was not afraid of white men like Charles Whitmore. He was afraid of what he was willing to risk for Sarah. The next few weeks were hell. Sarah was forbidden from leaving the house. Every move she made was watched. Every phone call monitored. Her father refused to speak to her, as if acknowledging her existence would somehow taint him. Her mother said nothing, only watching her with unreadable eyes. Sarah tried to fight. She argued. She screamed. She begged. But her father's will was law, and there was no court that would side with a daughter who dared defy the man who owned her world. And yet, she found a way. A letter slipped into the pocket of a delivery boy, a whisper in the ear of a maid who had once known love beyond color lines, a meeting late at night when the world was asleep. She found Oliver again, and this time she told him what he already knew. Her father would never let them be together, but she had made her choice, and she had chosen him. It was a reckless decision, a dangerous one. A white woman running away with a black man was not just scandalous, it was criminal. There would be no mercy, no understanding, no forgiveness. But love had never cared for laws. And so, in the dead of night, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the fire in their hearts, they ran. They ran from the chains of her father's power, from the weight of a world that would never accept them. They ran toward a future that had no guarantees, no promises, no safety, only the hope that together they could carve out a life of their own. They had no idea that the real danger had only just begun. The night air was thick with the weight of their decision. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the small suitcase she had packed in secret, filled with only the barest essentials: a dress, a few coins, a photograph of her mother that she wasn't sure why she had brought. It was absurd how little of her life she could carry with her. Everything she had known, her home, her name, her status, she was leaving behind. Oliver stood at the edge of town, waiting beneath the shadows of the abandoned train station. He had no suitcase, no photographs. His whole life had always been light enough to carry. When she saw him, she wanted to run to him, to throw herself into his arms and let the fear fall away. But she held herself steady. There was no time for softness, no time for hesitation. They had only one chance to disappear. The train that would take them north was due within the hour. It was a freight train bound for a factory town in Illinois, where mixed-race couples were rare but not illegal. It was their best option. Sarah glanced behind her one last time, half expected to see her father's men storming toward her, dragging her back to the life she had just abandoned. But the streets were empty. Still, the fear lingered. Oliver took her hand, rough, calloused, steady. "Are you sure?" His voice was quiet but firm. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. They boarded the train, hiding among crates and sacks of grain. No one saw them leave. No one knew where they were going. For the first time in her life, Sarah was free. The journey was long and grueling. They traveled in darkness, their bodies stiff from crouching in the narrow space between cargo boxes. The sound of the train wheels rattled through Sarah's bones, each clank a reminder that there was no turning back. Oliver barely spoke. He was always listening, always watching. Every time the train stopped, he tensed, waiting for the sound of approaching footsteps, for the doors to slide open and reveal men with guns ready to tear them apart. But no one came. On the second night, they reached Illinois. The factory town was a far cry from the elegant streets of Sarah's childhood. The air was thick with smoke, the streets lined with soot-covered buildings. The people were weary from long hours of labor, but here they were just another couple. No one looked twice at a white woman standing beside a black man. It wasn't acceptance, it was indifference, and indifference was enough. They found a place to stay in a cramped boarding house where the walls were thin and privacy was non-existent. Their room was barely big enough for the narrow bed they shared, but it was theirs. Oliver took a job at the local steel mill, working 12-hour shifts in unbearable heat. Sarah found work as a seamstress, her fingers blistered from long hours of stitching. It was hard, grueling, and nothing like the life she had known, but she never complained because, for the first time, she had chosen this life. The marriage took place in a tiny church on the outskirts of town. There were no guests, no flowers, no music, just the two of them and a preacher who looked at them as he muttered the vows. There was no ring, no celebration, just a quiet exchange of promises, spoken not for the world, but for each other. When the ceremony ended, Sarah stood outside the church, staring up at the sky, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. She was no longer Sarah Whitmore, daughter of privilege. She was Sarah Bryant, wife of a black man in a world that would never fully accept them. And yet, she felt lighter than she ever had before. The first year of marriage was a test. The factory town was safer than the South, but that did not mean it was kind. Oliver's co-workers kept their distance, uncertain what to make of the man who had robbed with a white wife. The women in the town looked at Sarah with wary eyes, unsure if she was lost, confused, or simply foolish. They were tolerated, but never welcomed. Money was always tight. Some nights, they went to bed hungry. Sarah learned how to mend clothes until they were more stitch than fabric. Oliver learned how to stretch every dollar, bargaining for scraps at the market, working overtime until his body ached. But they endured because love had carried them this far. And yet, love did not erase fear. Sarah's father had not forgotten her. Letters arrived at the boarding house, each one colder than the last. The first was a demand, "Come home now." The second was a warning, "You don't understand what you've done." The third was a threat, "You will regret this." Sarah burned them all, but the fear lingered. Her father was not a man who accepted defeat. One day he would find her, and she did not know what he would do when he did. That fear crept into her dreams. It whispered in the back of her mind when she walked through the market, when she saw men in suits glancing at her too long, when she heard footsteps behind her at night. And so, without telling Oliver, she began to save money. At first, it was just a few coins tucked beneath the mattress, then a few bills hidden in the hem of a dress. She told herself it was nothing, just a precaution, a habit born from fear, not from doubt. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had chosen Oliver, but part of her still feared that one day she would have to leave him behind. The years passed, and life in the factory town settled into a pattern. It was never easy, never truly comfortable, but it was theirs. Oliver worked himself to the bone, coming home each night with aching muscles and soot-stained hands. Sarah stitched clothes until her fingers bled, her once delicate hands now rough with calluses. They built a life together, piece by fragile piece. And then the first child came. Sarah had never been more terrified. She had expected joy, had imagined the moment she would place her newborn in Oliver's arms and feel the warmth of their family growing. But when she saw the tiny boy wrapped in blankets, she felt something else entirely: guilt. Because as she looked at her son, she couldn't stop thinking about the child she had abandoned. She had been 17, a different girl in a different life. Her family had kept the pregnancy a secret, hiding her behind closed doors, telling friends and relatives that she had taken ill, that she needed rest. She had never been given a choice. When the baby was born, a boy just like this one, she had barely been allowed to hold him before he was taken away. Her father had arranged for everything: a quiet adoption, a discreet payment to ensure there would be no records, no connection to the Whitmore name. Sarah had cried for weeks, but in time she had learned to silence the ache. She had told herself that it was for the best, that the child would have a better life without her, without the burden of scandal. And then she had met Oliver, and she had buried that past beneath a new life, a new love. But now, holding her newborn son in her arms, the past clawed its way back. She had another child out there, a son who had been lost before he even had a chance to know her. She never told Oliver. She couldn't. The weight of that secret settled into her bones, a quiet, gnawing guilt that never fully left her. Their son, Isaac, grew fast. His skin was a rich blend of his parents' colors, his eyes sharp like his father's, his smile soft like his mother's. He was the first thing they had ever truly built together, a living, breathing testament to their love. And yet, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She dreamed of the child she had given away. She wondered if he looked like Isaac, if he had her nose, if he had Oliver's steady gaze. She wondered if he ever thought of the mother he had never known. She never spoke of it. Instead, she buried it deeper, and she devoted herself to Isaac, to Oliver, to their life. But the past had a way of creeping back even when you tried to outrun it. Years passed, and another child came, Margaret. She was wild from the start, loud and unafraid, her laughter filling the tiny rooms of their boarding house. She had none of her mother's softness, none of her father's quiet. She was a force unto herself, a storm in a little girl's body. Sarah adored her, but with each passing year, the secret grew heavier. She imagined the boy, now a young man, living in some unknown city, perhaps in a house much like theirs, perhaps wondering who he was. She prayed that he had been given a good life. She prayed that he had never felt abandoned, and she prayed that Oliver would never find out. But secrets had a way of poisoning everything. Sarah became quieter, more distant. Oliver noticed. At first, he thought it was exhaustion. Parenthood was hard, and their life was not an easy one. But then he saw it. The way she would stare off into the distance, lost in thought. The way she would hesitate before answering questions about her past. The way she flinched whenever adoption was mentioned, even in passing. Oliver was not a man who pried. He respected silence, understood that some wounds were too deep to touch. But this was different. This was his wife, and she was slipping away from him. One night, long after the children had gone to bed, he found her sitting at the small wooden table in their kitchen, staring at a torn piece of fabric in her lap. She didn't notice him at first, and for the first time in their marriage, Oliver felt a distance between them that terrified him. There were things she was not telling him, things she never would. And for the first time, he wondered if he truly knew his wife at all. Sarah had always known that marriage was not the fairy tale that books and films made it out to be. She had known, even as a child, that love and survival were often two separate things. But she had never expected to live in a marriage built on both. Oliver was a good husband. He was steady, patient, reliable. He worked hard to provide for her and the children, never once complaining about the exhaustion that came with 12-hour shifts at the steel mill. And he loved her. She had no doubt about that, but she carried a secret that weighed heavier than any love could lighten. Because when she had married him, she had not done it out of love. She had done it out of fear. She had grown up knowing that her father would choose her husband for her. That was the way it was done in families like hers. Old Southern money, bloodlines that traced back to colonial wealth. Women did not choose, they were chosen. Her father had spent years grooming her for marriage, introducing her to the sons of bankers, lawyers, businessmen. He had lined them up like racehorses, inspecting them for pedigree, for wealth, for the right kind of arrogance. And she had played along. She had smiled, nodded, let them take her hand, let them lead her across ballroom floors. She had done what was expected until Oliver, until she had seen something different, a man who did not belong in her world, a man who made her question everything she had been taught. And she had run to him, not because she had loved him, but because she had been terrified of what her life would become if she didn't. The realization sickened her, because now, all these years later, she did love him. She loved the way he kissed her forehead before leaving for work each morning. She loved the way he rocked their children to sleep at night, low and deep, like the rumbling of the earth itself.